So on behalf of the AIA Southern Arizona, the School of Architecture, and the Tucson Museum of Art, welcome to the Lineage lecture series. The series aspires to open a conversation around two dissimilar yet tangentially related topics. Allow me to introduce just briefly this evening's speakers. So perhaps you already know this gentleman in black with the yellow tie. Rob Miller is the professor and the director of the School of Architecture at the University of Arizona. He holds degrees in architecture from Clemson University and Rice University. He was a professor in residence in Genoa, Italy, and the director of the Clemson Architecture Center in Charleston. He's been awarded a fellowship to the American Academy in Rome for his integrated teaching and practice and the ACSA Creative Achievement Award for his design build work. He's been named Educator of the Year by AIA Arizona, was president of AIA Southern Arizona, and as you know, will become the president of AIA Arizona next year. The gentleman in orange, Chris Taylor, is the director of land arts of the American West and an associate professor of architecture at Texas Tech University. He began developing land arts of the American West to investigate the intersection of human construction and the evolving shape of the planet. His books, Land Arts of the American West and In Cubo Atacama Lab, chronicle the development of his field research operating across the arid lands of the Americas. He is currently working to create the Great Salt Lake Exploration Platform to facilitate visual and performative research within the vastly underexplored landscape of the Great Salt Lake. He is a graduate of the University of Florida and Harvard's Graduate School of Design. So this evening, Rob and Chris will touch upon history, meaning, pedagogy, place, spanning the disciplines of art and architecture, with oscillations between the theory of experience and the experience of theory. Please help me welcome Rob Miller and Chris Taylor.
Thank you, Siri. That was a lovely introduction, and thanks for all your work on this series. It's an honor to be here with Chris Taylor. I'm the warm-up act, and I'm going to cover a lot of pretty heavy material quickly so that you can get to the real part of the show. So forgive me, but I'm going to need to work from a script for this. Sculpture in the Expanded Field by Rosalind Krauss was published in the journal October in 1979. In it, Krauss made sense out of a body of emerging works of art about which the art world didn't quite know what to make. Situated both in and out of the gallery, the works in question broke with modernist traditions, and they challenged not only the stylistic and material conventions, but the very system of patronage that was supporting the art world. In her article, Krauss mapped the conceptual shift that differentiated modern from postmodern art, and she showed how all works are dependent on, yet alter, the cultural classifications to which they are subject. This talk is taken from my chapter in a forthcoming compendium on architectural theory. While Chris Taylor will talk to you a little bit later about some of these works, I will use them to summarize Krauss's prescription for expanding categorical thinking, and then I'll suggest some ways in which her thesis can itself be expanded. We should begin by trying to imagine how very difficult it would have been to make sense out of the works that were the subject of sculpture in the expanded field. Krauss's analysis dealt with environmental art that deliberately put itself beyond the reach of galleries and museums, and for lack of a better descriptor, were being tenuously lumped together under the title sculpture. Her analysis demonstrated that these works were no longer bound by art's material and methodological categories. That is, you couldn't think of them as painting or sculpture, but they were driven by a new logic. This meant that while the new works were neither confined to nor generated from traditional categories, they would inevitably be read against these categories. In other words, to see these works as art meant that you couldn't help but try to force them into one of those boxes. And yet at the same time, their resistance to being forced was what largely led them to be art. The other implication of Krauss's thesis was that sculpture is an historical and not a universal construct. So what it meant to be sculpture was going to change over time, and Krauss's work showed how that would happen. She started with two works by Robert Morris and a 1950s quip by Barnett Newman, who famously said, "Sculpture is what you bump into when you back up to see a painting." Krauss proceeded to set up a series of oppositions that created what she called the expanded field. She demonstrated that works like those by Morris, provisionally referred to as sculpture, could be defined not by their materials and methods, but by what they were not. These works weren't sculpture in a traditional sense. If they were sculpture at all, that category was now defined, she said, by the territory between landscape and architecture while being neither. From this initial move, Krauss generated a broader field of operation. By redrawing art's cognitive map, outdated categories were replaced by new ways of thinking about and generating work. If sculpture had opened a space between not landscape and not architecture, then Krauss had stumbled upon 3 additional opportunities at the 9, 12, and 3 o'clock positions, which she proceeded to fill with subgenres that she named marked sites, site construction, and axiomatic structures. To skip ahead, these categories never really caught on, and this is where the rigor of Krauss's analysis began to break down and where applying her own techniques back upon her work might allow us to renew the case. So let's start by mapping some of the works cited by Krauss to their appropriate positions in the field. While the new subcategories added more distinctions, they remained categorical and imprecise. This version of the expanded field lacks a degree of subtlety that is essential to the works themselves, which, as you will remember, were intended to deny easy classification. Take, for example, Spiral Jetty, Robert Smithson's seminal work from 1970, which was assigned to marked sites, along with Michael Heitzer's double negative of 1969 and Christo's Running Fence of 1976. A marked site, according to Krauss, required either a physical manipulation of the site or some other form of site marking. By contrast, site construction relied less on the interplay with the natural site and instead imposed upon it an architectural form, as exemplified in the works by Alice Aycock and Mary Miss. The degree to which Spiral Jetty engaged its site, the work being activated by the rise and fall of the water, and its function as a datum that revealed the site's character, clearly made this a marked site. But because Spiral Jetty is an autonomous geometric form superimposed on the landscape, it also had traits belonging to site construction. So really, Spiral Jetty belonged between marked sites and site construction, close to landscape, but nudged between landscape and not landscape. But such flexibility was not possible in the original system, which underscores 2 of its liabilities. Firstly, more nuance is needed than was available from the square superimposed on a diamond diagram. After all, Krauss's point was to empower rigorous thinking about works whose essence came from denying categorization. generating more categories, regardless of how enlightening that was counter to the spirit of those projects. Secondly, Krauss's diagram offered distinctions in the horizontal, but not really in the vertical axis. That marked sites is to the left of landscape, while axiomatic structures is to the right of architecture, charts an affinity between the works and their assigned categories. Carl Andre's cuts on the far right is, after all, more like architecture, and Heitzer's double negative on the far left has greater affinity with landscape. But a similar distinction cannot be gleaned from the vertical positioning. All projects belonging to marked sites are simply trapped halfway between the positive and negative manifestations of landscape. So the vertical position really doesn't tell us that much. The expanded field would be much more meaningful if it facilitated a more nuanced positioning without creating subgenres. You okay? We're about halfway. I'm through my part. Okay. We can start figuring out how to get there by comparing Krauss's named categories to their generic types. The whole enterprise started by defining sculpture relative to not landscape and not architecture, giving us a negative genre category. Working backwards, as did Krauss, landscape and architecture were the positive terms or genre that generated this field. Okay? Crossing landscape and architecture then yields a hybrid or a cross genre at the 12 o'clock position. You guys are awesome. At the 3 and 9 o'clock positions, between genre and negative genre vertically, is a position that's neither positive nor negative, but neuter. Which brings us back to the 6 o'clock position, the one that's occupied by sculpture. Now be careful, because the original signifier here is actually a bit of a trap. The notion here of sculpture is not actually a genre as it's usually taken. Remember, it was really a placeholder for works at the time that could not be classified. Logically, the point at the most negative point on the scale of genreness would be the complete absence of genre, which is precisely where those original works that she was trying to categorize belong. They didn't fit any place. When we look at the genre properties behind the original diamond square, we therefore have two scalable axes. A horizontal axis of disciplinarity superimposed with the vertical one of genreness. And using crosshairs rather than categories, works can be positioned and significance derived from location rather than from labeling. The higher the position is, it indicates that the work is more embedded in an established genre. And the lower the position, it indicates a resistance to classification that way. Disciplinary purity is suggested at the extreme ends, while hybridity, the mixing of disciplines, is registered at the center. The crosshair system even allows cross-genre projects to establish genres of their own, which, as we will see, is a new development since Krauss's work of the 1970s. In practice, of course, the crosshairs would normally be off-center, right? They'd be pulled left or right when two disciplines don't have equally sized domains, or pulled vertically to reflect varying capacities created by genre versus anti-genre activity. All of which suggests that we should add to this system a z-axis to denote time. Charting disciplinary space over time would reveal the changing significance of projects as well as the field itself. And there's how that might look. The then crosshair denotes an origin of a project. If we pull that initial condition straight forward in time, The then reference crosshair denotes that starting point, so it gives us a frame of reference to appreciate what the now crosshair would look like. In this case, the crosshair has moved up and slightly to the right, so it gives you a way to read what those are, which in summary gives you a three-dimensional spatial matrix. So let's try this system out and see what we get. Let's do 3 quick, simple example projects, one for an innovative project, one for a traditional project, and one for a very radical project. Good? We all good? Got everybody with me? All right. For the innovative project in the landscape and architecture matrix, we'll start with Bernard Tschumy's Parc de la Villette of 1987. Innovative cross-genre works, if they're also influential, will start in the ambiguous center of the field and move upward toward genreness and often outward toward disciplinary purity. This is because an innovative project, by definition, will initially question its parent genre or its discipline's purity, putting it in the middle or lower part of the field. Being influential, though, it'll attract and inspire a following other works, and those imitators will follow a similar trajectory, and this in turn will change our understanding and reading of the initial project, but it will also change the characteristics of the field against which the whole thing is read. The lifting of the disciplinary axis over time in this example indicates a mounting challenge to the established cultural terrain. The negative genre space has been enlarged and the genre territory has been contracted. And if you lived through Tschumy's Parc de la Villette project, you'll remember that's exactly what happened in those days. The tilt, in this case, up on the right and down on the left, indicates that architecture, whose genre space is contracted more than landscapes, has undergone more challenges, which in fact it did. And the move to the right of the vertical crosshair indicates that landscape has expanded its purview in that cross-disciplinary space, which in fact it did. By contrast, conventional projects, in this case we'll take the Getty Museum of 1984 to 97 by Richard Meyer, will start high and usually to the side of the field. Do you see it up there? T1 to T2? It starts high and to the side, meaning that it resides in an established genre with relatively clear disciplinary territory, and it just stays there. As such projects do not challenge their disciplines or their genres, they do not move the configuration of the field. But without them, the genre or disciplinary spaces would contract, so they're really important if stabilizing forces in the whole system. Traditional projects, of course, are part of a lineage and might alternatively have been mapped as a follower in the trajectory of an innovative project, as was the case here. Following the trajectories of Le Corbusier's project in La Tourette or Hans Hollein's Agteberg Museum, the Getty probably was actually a cross-disciplinary project, even though we didn't take it that way, because it wasn't particularly innovative in those concerns. It merely developed languages that had been pioneered by others. So then we'll go to the radical example. A radical example would be one that doesn't have many forebears and few followers. And for this example, we'll take Libeskind's City Edge Berlin competition of 1987. As such projects are anti-genre and cross-disciplinary, they begin low and in the middle of the field. But even if they're widely known, are really radical projects likely to remain in this position due to the inability of the field or the incapacity of the market to follow it any place? In the landscape and architecture matrix, such projects rarely get constructed, and if they're outrageous enough, they really won't attract that many followers, though not always. For in this case, we see the Info Box of 1995, which is a bit of a mashup of the City Edge Berlin and the Parc de la Villette. But that's a kind of interesting side note. And thus we have a triaxial field using scales rather than buckets, which allows us to speculate on cultural reference, innovation, and influence of various kinds of projects, And for this, we really owe Rosalind Krauss a thank you for bringing these amazing distinctions to light. Conclusion. In the 1970s, cross-disciplinary projects could not have genre status because they were, genres were synonymous with disciplines. In the 4 decades since, however, more and more projects have crossed more and more disciplines, and a new category has emerged that has silently been institutionalized as a non-category category. Cross-disciplinary production has itself been institutionalized, albeit with a nod and a wink and a complicit understanding that we hold this work as ambiguous, anti-genre, and of mixed parentage. Disciplinary mixing is now expected. So while we could still chart disciplines on the graph, crossing them does not generate the same delicious perplexity that it once did. Unlike the old days when interbreeding was scandalous, the current work in this arena is overcoded so that it looks and feels like something radical, fuzzy, and anti-hierarchical, but it really isn't. Pioneered by Marcel Duchamp and later proliferated by the artists whose work was examined by Krauss, this non-category category has become, if not quite a cliche, certainly an established domain. After all, the High Line is to Parc de la Villette as the Getty Museum is to La Tourette. Not truly radical, just designed to look that way. This cross-genre has become a hard and fast, you can laugh, that's okay. This cross-genre has become a hard and fast cultural category in its own right and is no longer something tentative and equivocal. It's a category unto itself, but one that categorically denies its own categorization. Thank you.
So I'm Chris Taylor, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you, Siri and Rob, for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back in Tucson. Really have a fondness for this place, and so it's a real treat to be here. Tonight, I'm going to talk about the Lineage of the American West program that I run as a framework for pedagogy and a way to demonstrate the belief that it's a work that makes other works. I'm also going to talk about a project of the Great Salt Lake Exploration Platform that Siri also mentioned, and how it grows from parallel land actions and queries. We're going to cover a lot of ground and move really fast, so please fasten your seatbelts. Let's begin with Buckminster Fuller. Not until I was 4 years old, in 1899, was it discovered that my cross-eyedness was caused by being abnormally farsighted. Lenses fully corrected my vision. Despite my new ability to apprehend details, my childhood's spontaneous dependence only upon big patterns has persisted. We still have a lot to learn from Bucky reading big patterns. The spiral jetty is not a picture. It's certainly not static or stable. It's a condition, a lens focusing our attention to larger frameworks, to what is around, like the very near oil exploration jetty to the south, and its traces of industrial production and failure, to presence and absence. Ultimately, it's about material, rocks, salt, water. And it's about a walk, an experience. It brings to mind the writing of the architect Johanni Palazzma and his clear distinction between the image of a door and the act of passing through it. Or put yet another way, in the words of the late great Townes Van Zandt, you cannot count the miles until you feel them. We live in a fundamentally different world than we did just a decade ago. The evidence is filling in to support Paul Crutzen's claim that we are now living in the Anthropocene, a new epoch of geologic time where human effects are the primary agents of change to the evolving shape of the planet. How we examine these effects is an essential question driving the land arts program. Basically, land arts is a semester abroad in our own backyard. We use the pedagogic value of travel and fieldwork to investigate the landscape of the Americas. The world is our classroom. Class is in session. Our journey through it is a vital part of our conversation. Occupying the continuum of human intervention on the land, we link pre-contact settlements with contemporary earthworks, some existing only as faint traces. Other works you can visit, but you're not allowed to photograph, but you can draw them. We encounter scientific research installations and military and industrial land use. Most importantly, however, we're out there to connect this experience through our work, creating no-trace interventions that operate within the particular landscapes we inhabit. And this is a full-body experience, for some much more so than others. To help us negotiate the multivalent meaning of these places and to shed light on strategies to aid their comprehension, we invite the wisdom of field guests, writers, makers, interpreters, to join specific portions of our journey. Over the years, they have included people like art historian Ann Reynolds, Center for Land Use Interpretation Director Matt Coolidge, artist Joan Jonas, SIMPARC member Steve Badgett, writers Lucy Lepard, Tucson's own Charles Bowden, and Barry Lopez, Adobe Alliance founder Simone Swan, architect and author Uwe Flukiger, artist-filmmaker Deborah Stratman, this list goes on, and post-commodity members Kay Twist and Raven Chacon. Impelled by the logic of survival, we become a community in the field. Our social life and work are connected by the places we inhabit, and these places are never static. The shape of our interaction takes many forms and brings us to all sorts of places, revealing all manner of traces. We are as captivated by the discarded big gulp cup as the cow skull. The traces of human action we encounter run from minor to major. That sticker on the Trinity site sign contains the Howard Zinn quote that reads, "There is no flag large enough to cover the shame of killing innocent people." Sometimes you have to wonder if all the traces we encounter are real. Yet as Michael Gitlin said in his film, The Bird People, the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. Knowledge takes many forms. Ultimately, land arts is about time and space, about the nature of a journey, and what it means to live with the reality, what it means to contend with the reality of life on the road, including all of its obstacles. I like to think of obstacles as opportunities. Go!
What's going on?
The fans are going out of control. And Jay got her band stuck here, we got it out with a combination of sticks and might. And then Chris Taylor's about to blow through this and see if he cannot get stuck. So this is the third and final band.
It's not a competition, and sometimes we have to call for backup. There's a difference between traveling down a highway at 80 miles an hour with the AC on and the music up, to meandering down a country back road, to jostling down roads you have to stop from time to time and repair. Pulling us down these roads and into the field are the historic earthworks, such as Michael Heiser's Double Negative, which can be difficult to see until you're upon it. In 1969, Heiser made this sculpture out of space, out of void. It is a work to be entered. Heiser likes to make the distinction between size and scale. Size being how big something is relative to the world, and scale, how big something is relative to our perception. While there was much criticism of the machismo of Heiser's gesture when it was made, I believe the work is more complex today because of its interaction with time and erosion. It now begs the question, will this be legible as a human mark in another 50 years? With such a question, we arrived in 2009 with a laser scanner to record point clouds of data, millions of them, that accurately describe the physical condition and position of the work at that moment in time. And this helps open our ability to view double negative as more than an artwork, as an index of many other measures. Cycling through sites of wilderness and culture, we visit the legacy of Donald Judd in Marfa. For us, the essential aspect of that legacy is institutional, in what he created in the Chinati and Judd Foundations, making curatorial decisions to permanently locate artworks in physical settings. He created situations of deliberate and persistent fusing of art, architecture, and landscape. Our actions are fused to expanding efforts for maintaining focus and shape for what is ahead. Our itinerary is divided between work and interpretive sites, investigating diverse places and place-less areas that define the American West. Rather than divide the territory by political nation-state boundaries, we see the territory existing within distinct ecological niches, primarily occupying the Colorado Plateau, the Great Basin, and the Chihuahuan Desert. Our understanding of these places, these territories, is made real by our occupation of them and what we find out there. If we pay attention, and sometimes we must, the territory will tell us all sorts of things, intentional or not. Reading or listening to the stories we find in the landscape can be as vital as tracking the threads of the stories themselves. Like how Bosque Redondo culminated the long walk for the Navajo and Mescalero Apache, where they were interned from 1863 to 1868. Each fall semester, we set out from Lubbock for 2 months, traveling about 6,000 miles overland, the operation fitting in 2 vans, one for gear, the other for people, both tightly packed. Past student participants have been drawn from North America, Australia, Chile, and Spain, and have included art, architecture, art history, creative writing, graduate and advanced undergraduate students. We make electricity from the sun with photovoltaic panels on the roof to power our mobile lab and our solar-powered sound. We track our location and route with a global positioning system. We attempt to make sense of our tools in the field and manage the collective memory of the expanding land arts archive. We build our own infrastructure. Over the years, the cook tent has evolved considerably, as has our perspective. Drawing always helps make sense of things. Basically, the cook tent is a place to prepare for evening seminars, to make work, and return to at the end of the day. We often think of it as our mobile bunker, attempting, keyword attempting, to shelter us from the elements. And these elements directly impact the nature of our work environment. Sometimes the system fails and we lose our battle with the wind. This is always fun to return to, and it's happened more than once. Our kitchen is elemental. It's important to eat well in the field. We haul our own water, try to keep the utensils reasonably clean and the snack bin well stocked. A few years back, inspired by the Institute of Contemporary Art at the University of Pennsylvania, we acquired some folding beer garden tables for our meals. And they made a profound difference on the nature of our dialogue and our culinary aspirations. Yet still we're fans of the curious lunch stops, from interstate leftovers and forlorn loading chutes to transfer station oases. Hopefully everybody's doing all right so far. If not, that's good to check in. I like that Rob was checking in. This is a good piece of wilderness advice that just stick with us, it's gonna be okay. So one of the great things about taking people out into the landscape is bringing them to places like Sequoia Canyon and letting them experience an apparent wilderness that is seemingly untouched by human activity. Here it becomes possible to wonder, Are we the first people to stand here and look out over this vista? And then we look to the ground and realize that stacked line of stones dealing with the edge of a former structure. The reality is that human activity has touched the entire planet, and signs of that take many forms, particularly if we believe in this idea of the Anthropocene. Coming to terms with the language of these traces and our relationship to them is an essential objective of the Land Arts program. These languages engage many cultures. Not all of them are human. We're not the only creatures on the planet. The continuum of traces extends from ancient to the legacy of contemporary occupation. And it's essential to investigate what is beneath the surface and lurking around the edges. I trust you all recognize the Border Patrol camera truck there on the right. We visit Chaco Canyon because of its shift in human settlement it registers in the American West. The many stories and how they're told are as interesting to us as what remains. We are here to see how people occupied and built within the land. And also, since this is a national park, coming to terms with the highly regulated and managed space and the managed history is part of our experience. Chaco demonstrates a concentration of resources and energy, a leap, to build on a scale previously not attempted in the region. To help shape the range of things we see and the range of things we make, readings guide a regular frequency of seminars, usually held in the evenings around campfires. These conversations are tempered with other measures of time and space, and a little bit of panic. That otherworldly gray surface in the center of this image is not a mirage. It's something we all should worry about. It's a capped radioactive tailings pile on the Navajo Nation. To help make visible the unseen legacy of uranium in the West, we visit the partially reclaimed Jackpile Mine at Laguna Pueblo. From the early 1950s to the late 1980s, this was the largest open pit uranium mine in North America. Open pit and uranium should never be in the same sentence, if you ask me. Our guide is geologist and Laguna tribal member Curtis Francisco, and he helps us understand the magnitude of environmental challenges and how people continue to live with these challenges. The process and the feel of these challenges is direct and presented in very real terms. Clearly, this is a loaded landscape, and the signs are everywhere. We follow such signs to where they'll take us. Essential to land arts is the importance of inserting ourselves into the picture with distance and proximity, ideally through our work, measuring our experience of place, persona, process, and memory. Memory activated along our itinerary by places we visit, such as Wendover, Utah, because of its place in the history of atomic warfare. But mostly we're here to work with the Center for Land Use Interpretation. I trust you all know of this cool outfit, California-based, CLUI.org. If you're not, everybody write that down. Super important group. The center maintains a base of exhibition and residency support facilities here within this complex landscape containing the remains of the largest military air training base during World War II. It's an active ruin, complete with all the attending human erosion, as Coolidge likes to refer to it. Wendover describes itself, the city actually, part of their promotional material, as a city on the edge. It's an edge containing traces of many forms of testing and forms of erasure. Within this, there's an attempt to resettle or to settle this post-military territory. Here, the collective SIMPARC with CLUI have been building an off-the-grid autonomous base. Part energy and part aesthetic experiment, it also is all about operational details. South Base, the area where that Quonset is, remains an active civilian training ground. In Wendover, the military tested and developed methods of deploying the fruits of the Manhattan Project. The remaining architecture, as always, is loaded with stories to be unpacked, digested, and relayed. The seemingly empty territory of the Great Salt Lake Desert attracts things that like emptiness. It's a highly industrialized landscape, with installations like evaporative mineral extraction. Traveling into this terrain, we learn that places are rarely ever completely empty. An essential aspect of our time in Wendover is getting out onto the flats to work and reflect. In this landscape, it's easy to become lost between ground and sky. Helping us think about this problem, we've been joined by Bill Fox, who has written about the breakdown of human cognition that occurs within isotropic spaces, spaces that are the same in all directions. He talks about the impossibility of walking a straight line in a place like this. And given my nature, I figure, I'll fix my gaze on that far point and I'll prove him wrong. And then I turn around. And my footprints prove that I'm the one in error. This sort of empirical feedback is essential to land arts. Such lessons make real the power of the horizon on our ability to navigate. And constructions like the Bonneville Dike become visible as truly monumental marks in the land, 12 miles long and dead level. Land arts puts into perspective the large holes and long lines on the planet, like the bathtub ring in Lake Mead as a monumental drawing and an indicator of drought. It is important to read the line between nature and human construction not as opposition, but as dialogue, even when there is conflict in that dialogue. For some, like the artist Nancy Holt, lines connect out from ourselves to celestial events in the sky. Another line extending out from my work with the Land Arts program is the Great Salt Lake Exploration Platform. 12 years ago, Matt Coolidge took Steve Badgett and I for a drive on a bombing range. Yeah, it was technically active, so we were only slightly worried. We went out there for the bombs. We went out there to look at these canals where salty water or brine is pulled from the ground for mineral extraction. Standing there, we thought it might be productive to consider building a craft, a salt boat of sorts, to let us occupy these miles of curious canals. With a bit of time and dialogue, the salt boat grew into the Great Salt Lake Exploration Platform, or GSLEP if you like acronyms. We pitched the idea to the Graham Foundation in 2012, and with news of funding came the realization that, oh no, now we've got to figure out what we're talking about and figure out how to build this thing. Our core ambition was to find a way out into this particularly extreme territory. Our aspirational references range from Patagonia through the Pacific Northwest to outer space. Ciudad Abierta, Alexander Graham Bell, and Buckminster Fuller. We sought to design and build an agile and modular craft that would protect and propel us into the Great Salt Lake. A vital design imperative is to allow a small group of culture workers, artists, writers, filmmakers, historians, to remain on the lake for a limited period of time, make their work, and not die. Given the remote severity of this landscape, that final qualifier is significant. We began making small tests with various forms of electric propulsion systems. Powered by the sun, our roof area controlled how many watts we could generate. Our German motor needed 2,000 watts of power, so that set our roof. As the process evolved, key decisions and acquisitions from another research grant focused the range of our exploration. In addition to sorting out our design ambitions as a collaboration, we had to figure out how to build this thing. So Steve and I sent a lot of email back and forth with curious images like these. The component assemblies became important. A fundamental necessity for the craft is to be demountable in parts that a few people can move, so that we can launch anywhere on the lake without aid of a marina or boat ramp. In 2015, fabrication began when a bunch of material components and Steve showed up in Lubbock. We moved from design and through design and fabrication and tested through assembly as the primary framing assembly of this 16-foot by 34-foot platform began to stabilize. And as soon as the parts were made, we loaded them on a transport trailer to bring them to Utah for field testing. Offloading at Roselle Point to haul everything to water's edge, which, given that the lake's at historic all-time low levels, was about 3/4 of a mile away from where we could park the trailer. Fortunately, Steve designed a smart cart to ease the schlep of hauling nearly 3,000 pounds of tubes, panels, parts, and supplies, even people. The water provides our level assembly surface, a big table, and easy movement through flotation. Water is both friend and foe, with weather a major concern, for this is truly a surreal situation. Our platform is only partially suited to the extremities of this environment. After all, it's built on inflatable pontoons. The truss work is an effort to create a unified, rigid frame, so should we get caught in the midst of a storm, of storm-generated 10 to 12-foot waves, we might stay intact. Our biggest fear, besides having a pontoon rupture, is being surprised by a big weather system and being blown to the other side of the lake. Our motor is suited for ideal panning speed, not ramming speed, or for 50-mile-an-hour winds. If we are blown across the lake, just because we hit the shore on the other side doesn't mean we're going to live. While the conditions can turn dire, the lake is also transcendental. The sky often is active as the water, singing or vibrating with color. Here's most of the crew that assembled for our first test launch in 2015. And this initial launch proved fairly productive. It floated, even with several people aboard. We did some calculations on that, but Steve and I are quite empirical, so put it in the water was the way to test. Part of the danger and beauty of the Great Salt Lake Desert that we covered earlier is this possibility of becoming lost between sky and ground. And this is particularly true on the water. It's as if we're in suspended animation, emerging from a dark and mysterious place. And we are. Within this condition, we remain keen to consider the platform as a literal stage for people to do their work. Imagine a choreographer choreographing a dance or a theatrical performance here. Since the initial voyage, improvements continue to unfold. Steve made us an emergency shelter should we need to head for shore to wait out a storm. We've added a lightning suppression system and tried different deployment mechanisms. Here we're at the Antelope Island Marina on the southern arm of the lake. Basically, the workflow was consistent, assembling the components at the water's edge, although our schlep was much shorter. This access to the lake is hinged on the continued diminishing lake levels. The lake has been, through development around the Salt Lake Basin, has been dropping consistently for years. Last summer, we tried to put in that was more vertical at Lakeside, just north of the loosened cutoff. We also tested assembling the deck on shore and rolling it into the water. The loosened cutoff, that structure there in the background, is a railroad causeway completed in the 1950s that bisected the Great Salt Lake into two distinct ecosystems, resulting in the pink water on the north arm that became a major factor for Robert Smithson selecting the site for the spiral jetty. Because of continued reductions in water entering the lake, last spring a new breach was cut through the cutoff in an effort to equalize the levels on the two halves of the lake. And so we were eager to spend some time around this new breach. Of course, our experience is also tempered by use by other inhabitants. We've been joined by artists, geographers, landscape architects from Wyoming, Georgia, Minnesota, New York, California, and even a German journalist. Being able to dial in levels of enclosure with fabric panels has proved essential. Oh yeah, not all inhabitants are human, but we covered that before. Soundtrack, this is situational. All right, ultimately though, GSLEP is about venturing out there, out towards the horizon, to see what we'll find. And what finds us. For an empty place, there sure is a lot of curious things out there, like excavator tracks on the berms miles from shore. A central ethos of the GSLEP is how it operates, as an instrument, a vehicle, focusing attention beyond itself, or even through itself. In the end, this is less about the form of what we've made and more about how it can propel our interaction with particular places, specifically this extreme territory of the Great Salt Lake. And as quickly as the GSLEP can appear, it also disassembles and can be removed from the lake, returning to Wendover for desalination and to overwinter in a former bomb assembly building. The project continues to become enmeshed in larger cultural conversations. Here's the model just before being sealed up in a crate for shipping to the Parish Art Museum, where it was included in an exhibition called Radical Seafaring. So over the years, land art's responses to the field have covered a profoundly diverse range, often stemming from common impulses, with variations and layers of meaning. In the end, we have failed if this is just a great camping trip. How the work comes back, in Robert Smithson's terms, from sight to non-sight, is how we return to and help shape culture. Part of this return is advancing our long table dinners that grow to celebrate the exhibition with the students, families, faculty, and friends. The table maxes out at 99 chairs, in case you're wondering. Participants carry their land arts experience long into the future. So as we near the end of this journey, let's return to Spiral Jetty and the space between image, mediated experience, temporal afterglow, cycling again and again to ponder the space between ground and sky, the receding horizon, what Rebecca Solnit calls the blue of distance. Even though Smithson said the future tends to be prehistoric, the responses of the land arts participants is never one of closing down or retreating. Instead, outward momentum continues. It persists. We return to Bucky's big patterns, opening onto the vast terrain of how human actions and queries have made land into landscape. Thanks for your part of this journey.